The morning sun rose softly over Arlington, and the mist hung low above the endless rows of white stones. Each one carried a name, a story, a sacrifice. Standing in front of the tomb of the unknown soldier, Sergeant James Cole stood tall in his dark blue uniform, eyes forward, posture perfect. He had stood there for hours without a single movement except for the steady rhythm of his steps. The tomb guard duty was not an ordinary job. It was a sacred promise to guard the memory of those who had given everything for the country. James had trained for years for this honor. Rain, snow, or burning sun, nothing could stop a tomb guard, not even a hurricane. The world could fall apart, and they would still walk their path, step by step, in total silence. As the change of guard finished, James saluted sharply, then marched off with the same calm dignity that defined every movement he made. It had been a long night shift. His back was stiff, but he never complained. He changed out of his ceremonial gloves, but kept the rest of his uniform neat and pressed. After leaving the cemetery gates, he drove his old black sedan toward a small roadside diner that was popular among veterans. He wasn't famous or rich, but people who knew what he did often nodded to him with quiet respect. The diner smelled of coffee and pancakes. James sat at the counter, ordered a black coffee, and nodded at the old man beside him who was wearing a Vietnam cap. The man smiled. "You're one of the tomb guards, aren't you?" he asked softly. "Yes, sir," James replied politely. "Just finished my shift." The old man gave a proud nod. "You boys carry more honor than most folks will ever know." James smiled humbly. He didn't do it for praise. For him, the job was sacred, something beyond words. When his coffee came, he drank it slowly, eyes calm and distant, still half in the silence of the tomb. After a while, he paid his bill and walked out toward his car parked just outside. But before he could even start the engine, he noticed flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. Two police cruisers pulled up fast, one blocking the road behind him and the other sliding in from the side. His brows furrowed. Something felt wrong. Two officers stepped out. They looked young, maybe new to the job. One of them had his hand resting near his sidearm. James rolled down his window as the first officer approached. "Sir, please turn off the vehicle and step out," the officer ordered firmly. James did as told without question. He stood up straight, his posture naturally disciplined. His uniform still gleamed, the ribbons on his chest shining faintly under the sunlight. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked in his calm, even voice. The officer's eyes ran over him suspiciously. "We got a call from someone in the diner," he said. "They said a man in a military uniform was pretending to be a soldier and asking for discounts." James blinked slowly. "I didn't ask anyone for a discount. I paid full price for my coffee. You can ask the cashier." But the officer didn't seem convinced. "We've had impersonators before," he said. "People wearing fake uniforms to impress others. I'm going to need to see your identification." James reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his military ID. He handed it over carefully, keeping his movements calm. The second officer joined in, leaning over to look at it. "This doesn't look right," the younger one muttered. "These can be printed online." James's jaw tightened slightly. "That's an official military ID, sir," he said. "You can check the serial number." The first officer frowned. "We'll call it in. Until then, please stay where you are." James stood there beside his car, silent, patient, but clearly uncomfortable. Cars were slowing down to see what was happening. A few people from the diner had come out, whispering among themselves. Someone raised a phone and began recording. The officer radioed dispatch. "Control, we've got a possible impersonator here. Claims to be a tomb guard from Arlington. Sending ID details now." The radio crackled back with static. "Copy that. Hold position." James could hear his own heart beating slowly. He knew this would clear up in minutes once the ID was verified. But it still stung. After all the nights of standing in storms, guarding the tomb in silence, being questioned like a liar felt heavy. The younger cop looked at his medals again. "You got these where?" James looked him in the eye. "Ironed them, one by one. But that doesn't matter right now. What matters is respect. Respect goes both ways, the officer said coldly. James didn't reply. He knew arguing would only make it worse. Instead, he stood quietly, hands behind his back, in the same way he did while on duty. The people watching could sense something wasn't right. The man in uniform wasn't nervous or defensive. He stood like a soldier, calm, steady, proud. Minutes passed. The officers walked around his car, checking the plates. The air grew tense. A child nearby whispered to her mother, "Mom, why are they stopping him? He looks like a real soldier." Her mother shushed her, not knowing what to say. James's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't reach for it. He didn't want to make any sudden moves. He stood like a statue. The officers kept glancing at him, then at each other. Finally, the radio crackled again. "Unit 12, we're checking the ID. Stand by." "Something's coming through the military channel." The first officer lifted an eyebrow. "Military channel?" James looked up slightly. "Yes, because it's real." The younger cop scowled. "We'll see." Another minute passed. Then 2. Then 3. The radio stayed silent, and the tension grew thick. James could feel the crowd's curiosity turning into discomfort. Some were whispering that maybe the police had gone too far. Others weren't sure what was happening. Suddenly, the radio came alive again. But the voice that spoke wasn't the usual dispatcher. It was deeper, more formal. "This is military command operations. Identify the detained individual immediately." The officers froze. One of them answered nervously, Yes, we have a man here. Sissy Sergeant James Cole. Tomb Guard, Arlington." The voice replied quickly, "You are to release Sergeant Cole immediately. Do not detain or question him further." Before the officers could even react, the distant sound of engines filled the air. The crowd turned as a black SUV appeared at the end of the street, followed by Humvees painted in army colors. They moved fast but steady, no sirens, just the low, heavy rumble of engines with purpose. The officers looked confused. The first one muttered, "What the who called them?" James didn't say a word. He simply stood where he was, his eyes calm, almost unreadable. The SUV stopped, and from it stepped a tall man in a decorated officer's uniform. His voice cut through the air as he approached. "Sergeant Cole." "Sir," James said, saluting crisply. "At ease, Sergeant," the officer said firmly, then turned toward the stunned police officers. "Which one of you detained a tomb guard from Arlington National Cemetery?" Neither officer spoke. The colonel's gaze hardened. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" The younger cop tried to explain. We got a call. Someone said." "I don't care what someone said," the colonel interrupted sharply. "You stopped the soldier who stands guard over the unknowns. The men who never made it home. You stopped him like a criminal." The silence that followed was heavy. The onlookers barely breathed. The colonel gestured to one of the soldiers behind him. "Show them his clearance." The soldier handed over a document marked with an official seal and signature. "He has top-level clearance and national security clearance attached to his duty. You detained him over a diner complaint?" The police officers were pale. The first one swallowed hard. "We're sorry, sir. We were just following." "Following what?" the colonel snapped. "Assumptions?" James stood silently beside his car, not gloating, not smiling. His face was calm, his discipline unshaken. He didn't need to say a word. His quiet dignity spoke louder than anything. The colonel turned back to him. "You all right, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir," James said simply. "No harm done." The colonel nodded once. "We'll take it from here." The soldier saluted James before stepping aside. The crowd had grown larger by now, and some people began clapping quietly. The sound grew, spreading down the street, small but sincere. The officers looked at the ground, ashamed. James finally spoke, his voice even. "Officers, I know you were doing your job, but next time, look closer before you act. Not everyone wearing a uniform is pretending." The first officer nodded weakly. "Understood." As the colonel escorted James to the SUV, the people nearby whispered in amazement. The convoy started to move again, slowly, leaving the police cars behind. The moment would be remembered by everyone there, the moment when a humble tomb guard, falsely accused, was defended by the entire military itself. James looked out the window as they drove away. He didn't feel anger, only a quiet sadness that so many had forgotten what his uniform stood for. The uniform wasn't about power or pride. It was about duty, about respect for those who could no longer stand. He glanced at the horizon where the white stones of Arlington were still visible in the distance. That was where his heart belonged, not in arguments or headlines, but in silent watch over the fallen. And as the vehicles disappeared down the road, one thought stayed in his mind: honor needs no defense. It stands on its own, even when misunderstood. The engines of the military convoy hummed steadily as they carried Sergeant James Cole away from the roadside scene. Inside the black SUV, the air was calm but heavy. Colonel Harris sat beside him, his jaw tight with restrained anger. The other soldiers in the front seat stayed silent, letting the tension speak for itself. James looked out the window, watching the passing streets. He didn't speak much. His hands rested calmly on his knees, though his heart still carried the quiet weight of what had happened. After a few minutes, the colonel broke the silence. "Sergeant, that should never have happened. You were humiliated in front of civilians." James shook his head slightly. "Sir, I understand. The officers didn't know. They were doing what they thought was right." "That's not the point," Harris said. "They could have verified first. You've earned more respect than that." James turned his gaze from the window. "Respect isn't owed, sir. It's earned every day, even by how we react when others don't show it." The colonel studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "That's exactly why you're a tomb guard." When they reached the base, the convoy stopped at the main gate. The guards saluted instantly as they saw who was inside. The SUV passed through and parked near headquarters. Word had already spread. Some soldiers outside were whispering, looking at James with a mix of curiosity and pride. Inside the command building, Harris led James into a meeting room. A few senior officers were already waiting, including a general who had served at Arlington years before. They all stood when James entered. "Sergeant Cole," the general said in a calm but firm tone. "We've seen the footage." James frowned slightly. "Footage, sir?" The general nodded. "Someone filmed the entire incident. It's already online. Millions of views in just an hour." James sighed quietly. "Sir, I didn't want attention." "I know," the general said. "But the world saw how you handled it. You didn't lose your temper. You stood there with discipline. You represented every soldier the right way." James didn't smile. He simply replied, "Thank you, sir." The colonel added, "The department already issued an apology. The police chief wants to meet with you personally." James was quiet for a moment. "If it helps others understand respect better, I'll go." The general nodded approvingly. "That's all we ask. Sometimes honor isn't shown in battle. It's shown in patience." Later that day, they drove to the city headquarters where the meeting would take place. The same reporters who had been sharing the story online were now outside the building, cameras ready. As James stepped out of the SUV, flashes went off like bursts of light. Microphones stretched toward him, and reporters called his name, asking what he thought. If he was angry, if he planned to press charges, he simply said, "I'm not angry. The uniform I wear stands for respect, and forgiveness is part of that." Then he walked inside without another word. The police chief was waiting in his office, standing up as soon as James entered. "Sergeant Cole," he began softly, "on behalf of my department, I sincerely apologize for what happened. My officers acted without understanding who you were. It shouldn't have happened." James nodded once. "Thank you, sir. I accept your apology." The chief hesitated. "I've already spoken to the two officers involved. They're deeply embarrassed. If you like, they'll apologize to you directly. Let them keep serving," James said quietly. "Mistakes can teach more than punishment." The chief looked surprised but relieved. "That's very generous of you, Sergeant, truly." After the meeting, James left the building and stood outside for a moment. The cameras were gone now. The crowd had moved on to other stories. He looked up at the sky, wide, blue, and peaceful. He felt the same quiet he always felt at Arlington. That night, he returned home to his small apartment near the base. His dog, a retired military K9 named Scout, wagged its tail and barked happily when he opened the door. James smiled for the first time that day, kneeling to rub the dog's head. "Hey, buddy. Long day," he said softly. He fed Scout, then sat by the window with a cup of coffee. The moonlight fell across the folded flag on the shelf, the flag that had been given to his family when his father died in service years ago. That was why James had joined. That was why he had stood guard through storms and nights in endless silence. To keep that promise alive, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from the colonel. The footage is all over national news. The president's office just released a statement thanking you for your composure. James stared at the message for a long time. Then he set the phone down and looked back at the flag. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't want fame. He just wanted people to understand what the tomb represented: the silence, the sacrifice, the duty that never ended. The next morning, he woke early and dressed in his crisp uniform again. The sun was just rising when he arrived at Arlington. A few tourists were already near the tomb, waiting quietly for the changing of the guard. His commanding officer met him at the gate. "You sure you're ready to stand post today?" James gave a small nod. "Always ready, sir." When his time came, he stepped out onto the plaza. The sound of his steps echoed sharply. Click, pause, turn, click, pause, turn. The rhythm of honor. The crowd stood still, some of them recognizing him from the video. They didn't speak. They didn't need to dot as he walked. He remembered everything: the flashing lights, the misunderstanding, the soldiers who had come to his defense. But here, none of that mattered. Here, it was only him and the memory of those who never came home. Each step he took was for them. Each silent breath was a promise that they would never be forgotten. Hours passed, and the ceremony ended. When the relief guard arrived, James performed the change perfectly, saluted, and stepped back. The officer of the guard nodded with pride. Flawless, as always. As he walked off the plaza, a little boy standing with his father called out softly, "Thank you, sir." James turned slightly, smiled, and nodded once. It wasn't about thanks, but it warmed him nonetheless. Later that afternoon, as he sat on a bench under the shade of a tall tree, Colonel Harris approached him again. He was holding a folder. "You've been recommended for a commendation," he said with a faint smile. James looked surprised. "For what, sir?" "For standing still?" The colonel chuckled. "For showing the world what dignity looks like." "I don't need medals, sir," James said. "The tomb is enough." Harris nodded. "That's why you deserve it even more." A few weeks later, a small ceremony was held quietly at the base. There were no TV cameras this time, no reporters. Just soldiers standing in formation and a few families watching. The general pinned a medal to James's uniform, not for combat, but for honor and conduct. After the ceremony, a young soldier approached him shyly. "Sergeant, I saw what happened that day. You didn't yell, you didn't fight, but you stood your ground. That meant something to a lot of us." James smiled gently. "You'll face your own test one day. Just remember, strength isn't about anger. It's about control." The young man nodded firmly as the day ended. James walked once more through the cemetery paths. The air was still, and the white stones glowed faintly in the fading light. Scout trotted quietly beside him. He paused by the tomb and stood there for a long moment, head in hand. Eyes filled with quiet respect, he thought about his father, his fallen brothers, and all the unknowns resting under the marble slab he guarded. "They don't know our names," he whispered softly, "but we'll always know theirs." Behind him, a group of visitors approached slowly. One of them, an elderly woman holding a folded flag, recognized him. Tears welled in her eyes. "You're the one from the video," she said quietly. "My husband is buried here. Thank you for what you do." James bowed his head slightly. "It's an honor, ma'am," she smiled through her tears. "The world needs more men like you." James didn't answer. He just nodded and returned to his post, his shadow stretching long across the stone plaza. That night, as the stars came out over Arlington, he stood again under the faint light, motionless. Eyes forward, the wind brushed against his face, carrying the soft rustle of leaves. Almost like the whispers of the fallen. No one disturbed him now. No flashing lights, no doubt, no questions. Only silence. Only duty. And in that silence, Sergeant James Cole found peace. Not because the world had seen him on a screen, but because he had remained true when it mattered most. He had protected honor the same way he guarded the tomb, without anger, without pride. Just steady devotion. The misunderstanding that once embarrassed him had turned into something greater. It reminded people that behind every uniform, there was a story of patience, courage, and quiet strength. From that day on, whenever visitors came to Arlington and saw him marching beneath the wide sky, they didn't just see a soldier, they saw a symbol of what respect truly means. And though James never spoke about that day again, the world never forgot it. The phrase "cops stop a tomb guard" 5 minutes later, the military shows up became more than a headline. It became a reminder that honor will always defend itself, not with noise or pride, but with calm, unwavering dignity.